Yo, what up? I try to talk about issues on this channel in a way that will still be meaningful 5 years from now if someone randomly clicks on this video and doesn't know the context for the discussion I'm having. And I think that still 5 years in the future, we're going to have an issue where vegans react negatively to this question of what about farm laborers? What about, the human rights of people who are picking vegetables? Where people react to that in a negative and defensive way because it is thrown in the faces of vegans as an excuse, not with sincere interest, not really as a sincere question at all. It's thrown at vegans in the same way that what about lions is thrown at vegans. Yeah, well, what about lions? Do you want to have a conversation about lions? You want to talk about habitat conservation for lions? You want to talk about natural parks and the diets of lions and how to keep a lion in this? Okay, yeah, all right. I'm vegan, but I can talk to you about lions, no problem. Maybe we can have a really interesting conversation. What do you know about lions? Are lions an important part of your life? I remember growing up with the sound of lions growling on the horizon. Look, man, sorry, this is a strangely jocular way to start the video, but my point here is, what about lions could be a meaningful conversation, could be the beginning of an important set of questions, but we as vegans normally just encounter it as a kind of hostile, contemptuous, and dismissive thing. Likewise, the question of, well, where does your fruit come from? Where do your vegetables come from? That does link to a whole bunch of really important and meaningful questions. But most vegans are apprehensive and respond negatively because they're only used to hearing that as a kind of dismissive distraction, as an excuse for why people eat meat anyway. So coming from a perspective of meat eaters who say, well, if you can't be 100% morally pure, why should I try to even be 10% or 50% morally pure? If somebody is going to get exploited by something anyway, then why shouldn't I just continue to eat hamburgers? Now, not everyone can be interested in everything. I am someone who's interested in how our food is produced, where rice comes from, where vegetables and fruit come from. I'll come back to that interest in a second. But I understand not everyone can be. For a sort of parallel set of questions, I think it is really interesting to look at where clothing comes from. Now, obviously, vegans refuse to wear leather for moral reasons. Vegans also refuse to wear wool for ethical reasons. That really makes my life difficult because here in Canada, men's clothing it's all made out of wool. It's a huge problem for me. It's really difficult for me to find remotely respectable looking clothing. But someone could say, quite correctly, well, what about factories that make clothing out of cotton? What about human rights? What about the conditions of workers? And this is a meaningful question. This can be a meaningful question. But if people are asking it just in a dismissive way of saying, well, conditions in clothing factory, this shirt is just cotton. Obviously, everything I'm wearing is vegan. But still, what about the human rights of people who make these clothes in this kind of context? There's a really good documentary called China Blue. It's just 2 words, China Blue. I could put a link in the description. I think you can see that online for like 99 cents. I remember I paid for it. I saw it legitimately, but it was either 99 cents or $1.99, so it's almost free. And that's a really memorable portrait of what factory conditions are like. Not in the worst factory in China by any means. It's really not. It's not remotely the worst. If anything, at that point in time, it might have been an above-average factory in terms of quality of life for people there. In many ways, it's a good factory, and that's why the owners of the factory allowed the documentary to be made. But nevertheless, you look at the kind of crummy, difficult, terrifying life the people in that factory are living in many ways. You get the kind of human story of it. And now you got questions. Now, so say a little bit more about me and my interest in this field. Yes, I was interested in migrant workers and farm conditions back when I lived in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I was a political science student at the time. I was a much younger man. And, we had this bizarre situation in southern Ontario where our farm produce was being picked by Nicaraguans. And as I looked into this, you might think these Nicaraguans would cross the border just once and then stay in Canada for a long time. No, even though they were illegal immigrants, these Nicaraguans were almost universally, they were returning to their hometown once a year. So they were going by land and illegally crossing those borders annually. And of course twice, because you got to go in one direction, turn around and come back. So going from Canada into the U.S., from the U.S. into Mexico, and then from Mexico down to Nicaragua. Totally unbelievable, surreal situation. And the jobs they were doing, those Nicaraguan farmers, were jobs that in my grandfather's time would have been done by white Canadians, white English-speaking Canadians, who also probably did not have great working conditions. But to me, from that study at that time, when I was interested in those questions within Canada, because these are not questions you'd be interested in globally. The situation for farm workers in Canada is not the same as it is in China. You know, you've got to develop these expertise in a way that's salient to a particular place at a particular point in time. Oh, and I should mention, in terms of point in time, I read some articles recently about Ontario, again, specifically about apple farming in Ontario, where they were talking about the former pattern of illegal immigrants from Nicaragua now being replaced with legal immigrants from the Philippines, importing cheap laborers from the Philippines under current government programs. Again, bizarre, just the distances involved. So your apples are being picked and packed by people from the Philippines. And these Filipinos, in order to get the paperwork, a lot of them have qualifications as nurses and school teachers. They're being kind of underemployed in our farming industry. Really strange set of questions. But I mention this because this shows how much the situation can change in just a few years. In one particular place, in one particular point in time, the question of who is doing the farm labor is worth thinking about and is worth looking into. But the answers may not be what you think they are. But look, in my grandfather's day, this type of agricultural labor was done by white English-speaking Canadians. And stereotypically, those guys were hobos. If you look into the history of the term hobo, this was a specific stereotype about the type of guy who would ride the train for free to get back and forth between the city and where the fruit was harvested, who would do seasonal labor, and then who would stereotypically be a drunk or an alcoholic in between harvest seasons when they were neither picking nor planting and so on. And back in the 1930s and so on, there was a whole subculture surrounding this. Guys like Woody Guthrie have all these songs about being a hobo, and they specifically refer to work on a farm. These were guys who lived part-time in the cities and part-time in the countryside and so on. So I say this to say I'm not glorifying the past. That had its own social contradictions and its own form of oppression and so on. But there are fundamental differences. If those jobs in southern Ontario working on those farms were being done by Canadian citizens, those Canadian citizens can go to the police if there's a problem. They can speak English. In theory, they can form a union and they can bargain for higher wages. They can access health care. If you're a Canadian citizen, you can go to a hospital and you can demand to get treatment even if you don't have any paperwork. You speak English fluently and you're a Canadian, one way or another, you can go to the hospital, you can go to a doctor. If you're an illegal immigrant from Nicaragua and you get injured, whatever, all kinds of accidents happen, what are you going to do, right? Nobody really wants to talk about this issue because politically, you are presumed to be right-wing if you in any way question the current neoliberal paradigm of mass migration for low-wage labor, whether it's questioning the Filipino example or the Nicaraguan example or what have you. If you in any way try to say, look, I think this is deeply problematic, and yes, the issues of it being cross-border labor really do change the picture. They really do in a meaningful way transform a situation that would have issues of exploitation and poor wages to begin with, and it gets dramatically worse because of those questions. I did a whole exhausting semester-long course dealing with migration politics last year, and at the beginning I talked to the professor and I said, well, you know, these are really important issues and I've cared about them for years and years, but nobody can talk about them in Canada. They're in a black box of political issues nobody can discuss because neither the left wing nor the right wing nor the center, nobody can deal with questions of migration and labor rights. I remember the professor reacted. She didn't know what I was talking about. Yeah, well, during that course, let me tell you, she knew what I was talking about. Just asking these questions is, I can tell you, in Canada, is not politically acceptable. not for any. It's become part of the unquestioned new normal of neoliberalism. That, in Ontario, Canada, we eat food produced by Nicaraguans and Filipinos, and that we don't deal with the surreal contradictions and questions that raises. So look, I also lived, if you watch this channel regularly, I used to live in Laos, I used to live in Cambodia. In that part of the world, I was heavily interested in where my food came from and food production and agriculture. I don't even mean where my food came from. I was really interested in agriculture, and I hung out with agronomists, and in terms of what I could speak about in the Lao language, I learned all this vocabulary related to rice farming, and I did so much research both on what agriculture was, the farming that was going on, and about government policies, UN policies, international policies, how agriculture had been changed in recent years. I was really into it. I was massively into agriculture in that part of the world, where, of course, there were very different questions of human rights and wages being paid and what have you. It's a totally different, although somewhat parallel, set of questions surrounding food production. But yeah, that was something I was really interested and really passionate in. And I can remember talking to one woman, a woman whose her university diploma was in agronomy. And I said to her, look, honestly, for years now, I was thinking if I could do my life over again, I wish I would have gotten a diploma in agronomy. Now, I don't feel that way anymore, actually, for all kinds of reasons. I don't regret that wasn't my academic focus. But I just say, not in a trivial way, during those years in Asia, these issues were a meaningful part of my life. Now, they're not right now. And as a vegan, I don't think we can say in a simple way that they have to be. Yes, how legumes are produced, how vegetables are produced, how rice and wheat are produced, those are really important questions. But I think if you met someone who was vegan, who had no interest in those things, but who was really interested in how toys are produced, that's also a completely legitimate area of study. If you're a parent, I've got a 2-year-old daughter, I got to buy gifts and send them to her in the mail. And it's a problem for me that most of this stuff is kind of plastic and manufactured in China. And I wish I had more positive alternatives. And I'm out there looking all the time. Can I get something made out of wood? Can I get something made in a country that has human rights? Believe me, if you're talking about manufactured goods, there's a huge difference between something made in South Korea and something made in China. Something made in Thailand even though, God, I know too much about factory conditions in Thailand. I know about factory conditions and farm conditions in Thailand because I've done the research. But look, it's not out of false humility that I say not everyone can be an expert on everything. And it's good to be honest with yourself and others about what you care about, where you are going to try to exercise your limited capacity for activism. And for some people, that's going to be agriculture. For some people, that might be clothing, like this documentary I mentioned about how blue jeans get made called China Blue. And migrant workers' rights, it is a specific issue. It's a single issue. Not everyone can be an expert. Not everyone can be an activist. But obviously, the inspiration for this video, in terms of why I just filmed this now, was just getting ready to work out before I go to school, is I'm happy for this guy, the vegan cheetah, Charles Marlowe. I'm happy for him that he's, pursuing his own interests. I don't look at this guy the way other people do. Other people look at him kind of hypercritically, as if, why can't he be the perfect vegan messiah? I look at him the same way I look at my own brothers, which I said years ago when I first made a video talking about the guy. I have 99 different brothers. Several of them have had lives, dented by drug and alcohol use. A guy like Vegan Cheetah, he probably had not thought about any of this stuff 5 years ago. And in the past couple of years, he got really politically awakened by veganism. And at first, his engagement with veganism wasn't political. Then he starts asking these other questions. He gets more engaged. And those lead to new questions, new political interests, new forms of political engagement. And that's great. And that's wonderful. And I would be so happy if any of my own brothers responded that way, any of my brothers or sisters. And they don't. And I think less of them. I got to tell you, my brothers and sisters, in terms of DNA, I don't think they were born, innately less intelligent than myself, but they have never started on that path that Vegan Cheetah went down. Now, on the other hand, again, at the very beginning of this video, I said why many vegans react negatively to these questions being raised. And again, just simply, vegans shouldn't get defensive. No, you can't research everything. No, you can't be interested in everything. And no, it is not necessarily a reproach against you if you are not interested in rice agriculture in Laos or in apple farming in Ontario. They're all specific issues. And instead, if your interest and your capacity for activism is attached to clothing production or toy production, do that. Politics is the art of the possible. Figuring out what's possible. And the reason why veganism is such a huge issue is that it's possible for everybody. It's possible for you here and now, no matter who you are watching this video. And it is not possible for everybody to be engaged with factory conditions in China, farm conditions in Ontario, or any other specific issue. But if you can, it's wonderful.